Water is one of the most important things that every plant needs to live, regardless of what it is. So in today's video, we're going to go over a few tips and tricks that you can use to get large, healthy transplants, as well as a few common mistakes to avoid for best success. Let's get into it. Now before we get started, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future content. We're posting videos weekly so that you guys can have all of your garden questions answered to be able to grow your best garden possible. And if you could, drop in the comments what your favorite way to water your plants are. Not only am I curious to see all of the different ways that you guys water your plants for best success, but it also helps all of the viewers watching this video and reading the comments to be able to implement those things into their garden as well. The first tip that is becoming an increasingly popular method for seed starting is bottom watering. Now, bottom watering is exactly what it sounds like. It's taking a tray, filling it up with water, and allowing your plants to soak up that water from the bottom instead of just pouring the water over the top. Now, this method has two main benefits to it. And the first is that you're much more easily able to control how much water you're giving to your plants. Because we're watering from the bottom up, you're really able to control how much water is going into your cells based on how much water is in the tray. To whereas if you were watering from the top, a lot of times you can't tell exactly how much water is going into them. From experience, I would water from the top. I wouldn't think that I put too much water in the cells, and then I would check and those cells were just completely waterlogged just because it was more of a guessing game and I wasn't taking that step to be exactly correct in putting the right amount of water in the bottom and allowing my plants to slowly soak it up at their desire. Now I will say, if you do decide to bottom water, make sure that you're only filling the trays up about a quarter to halfway. If you fill them up the entire way, all the way up to the top, and you set the cells inside of them, that water is going to press all the way up into the cells, and before long, with literally no time at all, the entire cell is going to be full of water, and it's going to do the exact same problem. They're going to get waterlogged. So to avoid this problem, just fill it up about a quarter to halfway so that your cells can very slowly soak up that water. Another thing is that when the soil inside of the cells absorbs the water up to about halfway, take the cells outside of the tray. Because we're using things like peat moss, cocoa coir, those mediums all act as a sponge and absorb a ton of water, a lot more than the plants need. So by taking them out of the water once they're about halfway, that bottom half is more often than not going to be pretty waterlogged. It's going to have way too much water in it. And by taking it out of the water at the halfway point, you're allowing that top half of the cell to slowly absorb the bottom half that has way too much water in it. And in the end, you're going to have cells that are perfectly moistened. They're not too dry, but they're also not too wet, which is super important. To whereas if you are watering and you allow the cells to soak up the water all the way, you're going to be in the same issue as if you water too much from the top. Your cells are going to be waterlogged, and in the end, you're going to have a lot of unnecessary or a lot of issues that you could have avoided at the beginning. So to avoid that problem, again, just make sure that you're only filling your tray up about a quarter to halfway up. Otherwise, if you fill it all the way up, your cells will absorb all of that water, and within minutes, they will be waterlogged, which we don't want. But then the other thing is that once the cells absorb the water about halfway up, take them out of the water or dump the water out of the tray, and that top half will absorb the water like we talked about, and in return, you're going to have perfectly watered plants, and they're really going to thrive. All right, the next thing that we're going to go over that we kind of already went into in the first tip, but I still think it's pretty important to clarify, is making sure that you don't overwater your plants. An overwatered seedling that's been given too much water even once, a lot of times the leaves will start to turn yellow, they will fall off, the roots will start to rot, and then the plant will not be able to absorb any water at all. And in return, most of the time, the plant will die. So it's super, super important that you do not give your plants too much water. Otherwise, these things will occur. By overwatering your seedlings, your soil will no longer contain those air pockets or the available oxygen that a plant can use to air out, meaning that you're going to create a very sterile or anaerobic environment. And no plant can really survive in something like that for too long, especially when we're talking about garden plants. So it's super important that you do not overwater your plants. Like we talked about earlier as well, if you overwater your seedlings, those roots will start to rot, and before long, the roots won't be able to absorb any water at all. So you may think giving your plants too much water or giving your plants a lot of water at the beginning will do good, but really in the end, it's just going to prevent the plants from being able to absorb any water at all. All right, the next tip that I've got for you guys today is allowing your soil to dry out in between plantings. Now, for the same reasons that we talked about before, it's super important that you give your soil or give your plants time to breathe, whether that is from the plants absorbing the water over time or just from it evaporating into the air. Either way, it's giving the plants that air or that airflow that they need. It's allowing your root systems and your plants to get the oxygen, get those air pockets, and it just creates an environment to where your roots aren't just sitting in super soggy, wet soil, and they're not just suffocating. So after you've moistened your soil, you really want to make sure to not water again until the soil has dried about halfway down the cell. Or, for example, these larger containers, whatever container you're using, you really want to make sure that it's dried to about the halfway point. Now, the main reason for this is, of course, like we talked about, to give the cells or the containers, whatever you're growing in, that soil time to breathe. You don't want to create that anaerobic condition or environment. You want the roots to be able to expand and to enter those air pockets and that oxygen, because those do allow the plants to just keep growing and not just sit there and get stunted and rot and all of the bad problems that can occur. So when you're watering, wait until whatever container you're using until it dries to about the halfway point. I say this because if you watered your plants and then it dried, only the top layer, you see the top layer dried, which does happen very quickly, especially when it's in a warm environment like the house or underneath grow lights. The top layer can dry out very quickly. So if you're going just based on what the top layer looks like, if it looks super dry and you're like, oh no, I need to water, make sure that you just use your finger and dig a little deeper, see if it's still moist, because if the top layer is dry and then you continue to put water on it every 3 to 4 days, you're gonna run into those same problems and give your plants more water than they actually need. The other thing that letting your soil dry out in between waterings provides is it allows the roots to grow downwards slowly as the water dries out. So allowing the soil to dry out halfway, it really does make those roots work for this water, work for the nutrients or whatever is in that soil, and it doesn't just keep them at the top. So as your water dries out in the soil, so those roots will follow that water. So not only does this create a more established root system and a stronger plant, but it really does keep the plants healthy. And if you do go to overwater your plants one day, or you accidentally do that, because it happens to all of us, your plants will have a much better chance of survival if that does happen, because they have more of a root system. Whereas if your plants were smaller, had a smaller root system, and you did overwater your plants, more likely than not, you are going to have a very low chance of survival when it comes to those plants. Whereas if you had those big, healthy, established root systems, yes, it may stunt your plants, and yes, it may do some damage, but you have a much higher chance of survival and a much better chance of your plants surviving through that shock. Likewise, if you didn't let your soil dry out and you constantly kept watering it every time you saw the soil dry out on the top, your roots, like we talked about a little bit earlier in this video, they will just coil at the top. They won't even try to go down towards the water at the bottom, because you're giving them all the water they need at the top. So for this reason, the plants are not going to be as strong. They're going to be a lot more susceptible to diseases or overwatering issues, because they just don't have much of a root system to get established and to get growing. So you may have already experienced this when growing plants, that you take the cells out, or the plants out of the cells, and you see only a little bit of the cell full of roots. This may be because you are giving the plants too much water, or just giving the plants all the water they need at the top of the cell. Allow the cells to dry out halfway down. It really does make a difference in the root development and in the establishment of a healthy, large plant. All right, the last tip that I have for today's video is something that is not mentioned often in other videos or in other places in the gardening world. And that's because it's not something that's really going to make or break your plant. But I still think that it's something that is good to talk about, and I really do think that plants benefit from this tip. But if you don't decide to use it, or if you are against it, it's not going to do any damage in any way to the plants. And that's watering the leaves of your plants. So a lot of people I know can get very confused, especially new gardeners. They will hear all over the place. I know I've heard this almost everywhere when it comes to watering your plants. And that's, don't water the leaves of your plants. This can cause a lot of issues, disease and fungal problems and all of this stuff that'll kill your plant. Those things are really more applicable to outside gardens or to gardening once your plants get into the outdoor garden. And that's because around here, for example, June and July, it gets very, very hot, very, very humid. And those two things, along with the pests and diseases and the pathogens that are inside of the soil that is outdoors, those things can cause fungal issues and diseases on the plant's leaves that can kill the plant off. Now, these things are not necessarily something that you need to worry about when gardening indoors. You are using seed starting mix, a sterile mix. You are starting all of your seeds in a sterile environment. And it's not going to get humid enough indoors, and it's not going to get warm enough indoors to where you need to worry about this. So I like to water the top of my leaves because inside a leaf are tiny microscopic little holes that will absorb the water, especially if you are using a fertilizer like a liquid fertilizer that you mix with water. 100%, I always recommend watering the leaves because those leaves are going to absorb water. They're going to absorb nutrients inside the water, and it's something that the plants really do benefit from. So if you're bottom watering, you can always spritz the top of your leaves with like a spray bottle. It does keep the leaves hydrated. So for example, if you have a very large plant in a pot and that water that you put in the pot does not reach all the way up to the top leaves because the bottom leaves are absorbing it all, those top leaves will become hydrated because you're spraying the leaves. So especially if you're using nutrients, you definitely want to give the leaves some type of douse with the water over the top. For example, if you are watering from the top, which I do that with a lot of my plants, just water over the plant. I like to do that a lot. I've found a lot of success with it. Those leaves will absorb all of those nutrients, all of that water, and it will keep that plant healthy and strong and those leaves nice and green. And that's really all I have for you guys today when it comes to watering your seedlings. Overwatering and some of the other problems that we talked about in today's video are some main culprits when it comes to causing issues for your plants. If you've seen yellowing leaves on your plants, stunted growth, and things like this, more often than not, it is a watering issue. So consider adding some of these things that we've talked about into your routine, and who knows, you may see a difference in your plants will thank you later. I really hope that you guys enjoyed today's video, and if you learned something new, please give it a like, subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future content coming soon, and if you have any questions at all, leave them in the comment section below. Check out our seed shop as well. We have a ton of awesome varieties over on our website that you can grow and follow along to grow your best garden. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.